Okay, today's daf, Bez Hashem, is Masechta Horayos Daf Ches. We're going to make everything big pretty soon. But I just wanted to give you a complete uh, animated overview. Have some fun here. So we're clear. So you get it clear. When a Jew does an Aveira to bring a carbon chatas, let's say he ate blood by mistake. Hi, Lewis, we just began. We just began. On the screen here, you see if a Jew does an Avera, he has a choice to bring as a carbon chatas either a female goat or a female sheep. That's if a Yid does, if a Yid did an Avera by accident, he brings a carbon chatas, one or the other. Now, if a king does an Avera, that's in the Chumash, it's called a Nasi, but let's say a king does an Avera, so then he doesn't bring a female, he brings a male goat. Okay, so there's a difference between a Jew and a regular king. Then the Chumash tells you, which we discussed yesterday, is a Kohen Gadol. A Kohen Gadol that does an Avera. So it's a two-step process. Okay, remember, it's a two-step process for a Kohen Gadol. One, he has to make a psak. He has to see how he's writing over here. Make a psak that let's say he paskins for himself, blood is mutter, or I'm allowed to carry on Shabbos, then does that Avera, then his carbon is a cow, a par. Okay? And then this one we're familiar with. This is the Avera of if the Sanhedrin gave a psak, okay? If the Sanhedrin gave a psak, you're allowed to carry on Shabbos. And the Jews followed whatever the Bezdin said. Then they bring one cow on behalf of Gans Klal Yisrael. So there's a similar two-step process between a Kohen Gadol and the Sanhedrin. They both paskin first, the Avera is done, and then you bring a cow. When it comes to Avodah Zarah, is two more things. When it comes to Avodah Zarah, then the Avodah Zarah is a little different. It's if you make a mistake in Avodah Zarah. Let's say a person by accidentally bowed to an Avodah Zarah. So if you're a king, or if you're a Kohen Gadol, you bring a female goat. Okay, the Kohen Gadol, it's questionable over here, and I put a question mark over here because normally a Kohen Gadol has to first paskin and then do the avera. When it comes to Avodah Zarah, we're going to see it's a machlekes between Rebbe and the Chachamim, but they bring one carbon, a female goat, and finally, by the way, this is in Parsha Shlach. I hope you encountered this once. And Parsha Shlach, it tells you if Gans Klal Yisrael, if Bezdin, okay, this is the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin made a psak on Avodah Zarah. Gans Klal Yisrael followed that psak. Then there's two karbanos that you bring. One is called an oila, and one is katas. So then they bring on the behalf of Gans Klal Yisrael one oila and one chatas, the cow for the oila and the sheep for a chatas. Okay, just to bring it up to speed over here. Okay, let us begin the daf, which is daf Zayin Amud Beis, and we're going to start from the Mishnah on daf Zayin Amud Beis. So pretty much everything will be straightforward. The Mishnah says like this. The Mishnah says like this: in order to be chayiv, in order for the bezdin to bring a par helim davar shel tzibur, we've seen this many times. Ein chayaven ella, that you're not required to bring a par helim davar shel tzibur, only if helim davar im shigigas masa. Helim davar, you know what it means? It means that they made a mistaken psak, and then shigigas masa, everybody followed the bezdin with that bad psak. V'chein Mashiach. And by Kohen Gadol, he has to first give a bad psak for himself, and then do the Avera. V'loy ba'avodah zarah. And not for avodah zarah, ein chayovim al helim davar shigigas masa. Same thing, avodah zarah, Bezdin has to first issue a psak, and then the Klal Yisrael followed, and then if the Klal Yisrael did the avodah zarah based on the psak of Bezdin, what's the din? You have to bring two karbanos. One is for an oila, and one is for a chatas. So that's the story over here. So now says the Gemara over here like this: Manolam How do we know that you have to do a shigigas masa too? How do we know Bezdin? The Rabbanim taught. It says in the pasuk, as you can see on the screen, V'mkola das Yisrael yishku v'nelam davar. The Chumash says that if Klal Yisrael, if the 71 of the Sanhedrin made a mistake, v'nelam davar means that they paskined wrong. So now, if it would just say Yishku, then even if Bezdin didn't paskin, if Gans Klal Yisrael made one mistake, they bring the par helam davar shatzibar. Talmud Loime Yishku v'nelam davar ein chayovim elo al helam davar mishkigus masa. They have to have a psak from Bezdin, and then a following of the psak of Bezdin, they did the avera. Says the Gemara, V'chein HaMashiach, Koy Mashiach also has to make a false psak. The ksiv, because the pasuk says la'ash mason HaMashiach getzibar. If you look at the psukim that discuss a kohen Mashiach doing an avera, here we go on the pasuk. The pasuk says im kohen Mashiach yachata. What does the Chumash say? La'ashmas ha'am. It's very similar to when Bezdin makes a mistake, and therefore the kohen gadol has to make a psak and then do the avera. Mind you, if a kohen gadol did an avera by mistake, he does not bring any carbon. That's a very important point. He doesn't bring any carbon, unlike a regular Jew. The Tanur Rabban, the rabbis taught. Avodah Zarah has its own story, because you bring only one choice. You can only bring a female goat. You bring a tzibor brings a parla oila and a seir lachatas. So when the Bezdin makes a mistake, I might think that halacha will be even if Gans Klal Yisrael did the Avodah Zarah without the psak of Bezdin. So nemakame einay, but nemalahal meinay, malahanay nechayim alhamdova shigas masa, afkan ein chayim alhamdova shigas masa. In other words, in Parshas Shalach, in Parshas Shalach, when it discusses when Gans Klal Yisrael did an avera of Avodah Zarah, the Torah tells you the hoya v'chi sisku v'laisasu is called mitzvah se'elef. They did Avodah Zarah, which is like all the mitzvahs. If me'enei eda, if the Bezdin paskind, so we need a psak of Bezdin, because it says me'enei over here, and me'enei by a regular power helam davar shetzibar. So therefore you need just like over there you need a helam davar. So also by Avodah Zarah you also need a helam davar. So now the question is, we know a kohen Mashiach has to paskin first and then do an avera. What about Avodah Zarah? Mashiach by the Zarah like ketonim asnisen. The Mishnah doesn't discuss that. Does a kohen gadol need to paskin first and then do the avera Avodah Zarah? Money. Who's our Mishnah going like? Rebbe. The Tanya we learned in Mishnah Ma'isa, Mashiach b'Avodah Zarah. Kohen gadol that does Avodah Zarah, Rebbe Omer b'shigas masa. All he has to do is do the mistake, and then he brings a carbon. The Chacham says not so fast. It's a two-step process, even for Avodah Zarah by a Kohen gadol. Helam davar. He has to first make a psak for himself, and then follow through on the psak. V'shavin, both Rebbe and Rabbanan agree, Seira, that for the Avera you bring a female goat. V'shavin, they both agree, She'ein Mevi Ashen Tali, that a Kohen Gadol does not bring a Ashen Tali. What's an Ashen Tali? If a regular Jew eats a piece of fat, and he's not sure if he ate a non-kosher fat or kosher fat, so the halach is, you bring what's called an Ashen Tali, a protection Ashen. If later on you find out that you ate the non-kosher fat, then you, by mistake, then you bring a chatas. But to protect you, you bring an Ashen Tali. A Kohen Gadol does not bring an Ashen Tali. There's no Ashen Tali. So our Mishnah goes according to Rebbe. So that was the first explanation that a Kohen Mashiach, since our Mishnah doesn't discuss it, must be that our Mishnah holds that a Kohen Gadol Kohen Gadol will bring on Avodah Zarah just by making the mistake alone. Says the Gemara of Tizbra, can you say our Mishnah only goes like Rebbe? Our Mishnah doesn't really discuss every detail of a Kohen Gadol, but just like it doesn't discuss that a Kohen Gadol only applies if he makes a mistake in something that bemazed you get karas and shogeg you get katas. Doesn't discuss that by a Kohen Gadol, but of course it's understood. So that's the same idea. That really, even it's not mentioned in the Mishnah. Our Mishnah would agree to the premise that in Kohen Gadol, in order to be obligated to bring a carbon for avodah zarah, he had to have a helam davar. My time of the Rebbe. What's the reason of Rebbe that says that a Kohen Gadol doesn't need Helam Davar? Well, look at the pasuk that says when you do Avodah Zarah. Omakra, the pasuk says when you do Avodah Zarah, an individual, the soul that made a mistake by doing a mistake in a sin. Hanefesh ze Mashiach. Hashegege ze Nosi. So the king and the Kohen Gadol bring a carbon if they do a mistake in Avodah Zarah. The Chetoi Bishkaga. And then the Chumash says if the sin was done by mistake. Rabbi Sava, Chet Ze Bishkaga Yehei. That if only a mistake happened, even a Kohen Gadol would bring that carbon, that goat. For abundant sovereign, no. That Chetoi Shkaga means to exclude a Kohen Gadol. Because a Kohen Gadol in all other Averis has to have a Helam Davar. So it excludes a Kohen Gadol. That if he did not have a Helam Davar, he's not going to bring that goat. Only if he has a Helam Davar plus the Avera. Vishavan Shabasira. But they both agree that you bring a goat. Right? Except the only machlokes is whether you bring a goat. Kiyachid, like a ready individual. Menolam, Damakra, Pasuk says, V'nefesh achas yachadav, echad yachid, v'echad nasi, v'echad Mashiach, is one soul. Kulam b'kulahal nefesh achas hein, and they all bring that one aver. So let's get it straight. By pagan avodah zarah, if they make a mistake, a Jew, a king, or a Kohen Gadol could bring a goat. But the question is, does the Kohen Gadol need the extra step of paskening first and then doing the avera? According to Rebbe, not. According to Rebbe, just doing the Avera obligates him to bring the goat. According to Chachamim, he has to have a psak first. Next Gemara, Daf Chesam and Aleph, Vishavin, they both agree, She'ein Mevi Oshim Toli. Minolan, they don't bring an Oshim Toli. Even a Kohen Gadol doesn't bring an Oshim Toli. Why? The Ksiv, the people of a Kohen Asher Gagose Asher Gog. Rabbi Sava Misha Kol Cheta B'Shgaga. The Torah requires somebody to bring an Oshim Toli if he would normally bring a carbon chatas by a regular mistake. But that's not a Kohen Gadol. Yotzezeh she'ein kol cheta b'shgaga elabam davar. Most of the time, a Kohen Gadol has to have a helam davar and then bring a chatas. So therefore, the pasuk by Oshim Toli excludes a Kohen Gadol. So says Gemara midi kol ksiv and dimkein nichtav al shegagosei lama li ashashaga kamashim lam da'aki ika kol cheta b'shgaga. Since it says Asher Shogag, the Torah tells you that the Oshim Tali is brought by somebody who would normally bring a carbon chatzis by just making a mistake. Yata Kai Mashiach she'ein kol cheta b'shgagai ela b'avodah zarah. Avodah zarah is the only exception. V'loy b'shar mitzvahs ela b'hamdavim shigig smaisa. By all the other mitzvahs, a Kohen Gadol needs helam davar plus the shigig smaisa. He has to have a psak first and then. So because of that, the Torah exempts him from an Oshim Toli. And Rabbanim is even more simpler. In all Averis, even by Avodah Zarah, he needs Helam Dava and Shigig Smaisa. Misha Cheta B'Shal, Yatz Mashiach, She'ein Cheta B'Shkal Guy. He never brings a carbon by just making a mistake. Loi by Avodah Zarah, Loi B'Sham Mitzvahs, Elam Dava and Shigig Smaisa. So let's get it straight. An Oshim Toli is a type of carbon that a Yid would bring if he's not sure if he ate fats, kosher fats, and non-kosher fats. It's like a protection type of carbon until you find out if you really did the Avera. If you found out you really did the Avera, you bring a carbon chatas. A Kohen Gadol, because of the pasuk, is exempted from ever bringing Oshim Toli. New Mishnah. Ein bezdin chayovim al ein bezdin chayovim ad shiyoyri bedovish is doine kares v'shigigase chatas. It has to be a type of Avera that if you would do it on purpose, you would get kares, and by mistake you get a chatas. And Bezdin has to paskin that such an avera is permitted. For example, You know that if you do Michal Shabbos without Edim on purpose, you get karas. If you do it by mistake, you have to bring a kar mechatas. So if Bezdin paskins that you can carry on Shabbos, and then the Jews follow that, that's the type of avera that they bring that they bring that cow. But if they paskin, let's say you're allowed to speak lashon hara, right, and every Jew started speaking lashon hara, they wouldn't bring a par hel and davish tzibur. It's only by a type of avera that b'mezid you would get karas and b'choigig you would get chatas. The Chayin Mashiach and same thing Kohen Gadol will only bring a carbon chatas. His chatas is only from something those type of averas. Basically, there's 31 averas. V'loy ba'avodah zara. And avodah zara, if they paskin, you're allowed to do avodah zara. It means that they paskin. Let's say you're allowed to bow to an avodah zara, even if it's not the normal way to serve the avodah zara. If let's say they paskin, you're allowed to bow to avodah zara. But if they paskin, let's say you're allowed to kiss an avodah zara. Well, kissing an avodah zara, even if you did it on purpose, you wouldn't get kares. You're over a law, but you wouldn't get kares. So that wouldn't be part of it. They have to make a mistake on something that b'mezid you would get kares, and b'shoigig you would get chatas. Minalan. How do you know that? In other words, it says v'im kol adas kishku v'nelam dova me'ene akol v'also ach mekol mitzvah v'noida hachatas hashachotol. And Bezin found out they made a mistake. And the pasuk uses the word aleha, right? So this aleha is extra. It darshins Rabbi Yomer nema kan aleha, but nema lahalan aleha ma lahalan dovish is doini karas shigurasei chatas avkan dovish is doini karas shigurasei chatas. We have Xer Shava, the aleha by parhalim dovish tzibor, with the aleha that it says legalis ervasei aleha by the arayas. So just like by arayas, you b'mezid, you get kares, and shoigig, you get chatas. So also the avera par helam davish and sibar that only applies if bezin paskin by something that b'mezid you would get karas, and b'shoigig you would get chatas. Says the Gemara Ashkeran Sibar. That is true by a carbon by par helam davish and sibar. Mashiach Menolan. How do you know the Kohen Gadol is under the same jurisdiction as the regular tzibur? La'ash Masam Hare Mashiach Kitzibur. The Torah always compares the cows that the Kohen Gadol that the tzibur brings is very similar to the cow that the Kohen Gadol will bring the similar cow like the tzibur. And just like the tzibur is only on something that's b'mezid kar and shagig katas, so also a Kohen Gadol will bring his cow only if he did an avera. If b'mezid you would get karas, so therefore he would bring a chatas, his cow. Nasi yal mitzvahs ksiv gabe nasi v'achas kal mitzvahs Hashem ksiv b'tziva v'achas su as kal achas mikol hamitzvahs mat tzibor davish is doine karas shigos chatas af nasi davish is doine karas shigos chatas. By the king we learn Xer Shava from the tzibor. And just like the tzibor is davish is doine karas v'shigos chatas, so also the king, he only brings a korban only if he did that type of avera. Obviously, if he's going to do an avera of lashon hara, he gets an avera, but he wouldn't bring a korban. Yochid, how do you know an individual that does an avera? How do you know if an individual does an avera by mistake? He speaks lashon hara. How do you know he doesn't bring a korban chatas? Amakarav in nefesh v'yumatachtem elyon. Since the thing that the Torah discusses is korban yachid, is an individual that does an avera. So you learn it the bottom to the top, that just like tzibur is davish is daine karas and chatas, so also yachid will only be chayiv a korban chatas only if he did an avera, like by mistake he was mechal Shabbos. Loy be'avodah zara. Avodah zara is always its own story by a tzibur. If a tzibur did avodah zara through the bezdin, they bring a parla oila and a chatas, right? And a goat for a chatas. I would think that the tzibur would bring their korban by avodah zara, even if it had nothing to do with b'mezid karas and shoygig chatas. Let's say that the bezdin paskin you're allowed to kiss an avodah zara. By the Torah discussing avodah zara, where people followed the bezdin, it uses an expression me'enai, as you can see in the screen over here, me'enai. So me'ena, you learn Gzeir Shava, parahelim davar shetziba, that it only applies, Avodah Zarah only applies by davar shezdan yikara shegas akachnas. Ashkan tziba, Yaakov nasi Mashiach menolan, Amakrav and nefesh achas, echad Yaakov echad nasi Mashiach, kulam b'chlal nefesh achas, yunatachtem in elyon. In other words, the next pasuk deals with the Yachid doing Avodah Zarah, and you learn the Yachid from what's written on top. Just like the Tzibar is Davish is Danikaris is Shigachas Chagas, also a Yachid. He only brings a carbon for Avodah Zarah, not for kissing an Avodah Zarah, but for actually bowing to an Avodah Zarah. Says the Gemara, this whole premise began, Hani Kalaman de Mapik law allow Lexer Shavak the Amram. It's only the only reason why you know by Parahelim Davash at Sibar that it's talking about Davash's Dainikara Shigasachatas, it's only because it says an Aleha Gzer Shava. But according to the Chachamim in another Masechta in Yavamas, we need that Aleha by Arias to use for another thing. So this Aleha is not empty. So the question is, then back to square one. Back to square one is Minalahu. How do you know Par Helam Davash Sibar applies by Davash's Dainikar Shigasachat? Answers the Gemara, Nafkale mit the Master Reb Shua Levi Lebrei. Reb Shua Levi taught his son. Pasuk says, Torah achas yilachem lo'oisi b'shgaga v'nefesh shetasa b'yod ramah. So we say, Hukshu kol ha-Torah kula l'avodah zarah. Ma avodah zarah shechayavin al tzedainikar shigasachatas. Avkan shechayavin al tzedainikar shigasachatas. That there it says, Torah achas yilachem, by the Pasha of Tzibur doing Avodah Zarah. And there it's talking about Avodah Zarah. We're going to see why. And so therefore the Kol HaTorah Kula is like Avodah Zarah. Just like Avodah Zarah, it clearly talks about things that are Shedoina Kara Shigase Chatas. So also, whenever it's the Sanhedrin makes a mistake, it has to be doing with something that's Doina Kara Shigase Chatas. Ashkechan Yochid, Nasi Mashiach, Bein B'Avodah Zarah, Bein Sham Masirah B'Nolon, Yalef Elyon Mitachta. So therefore, since Yalef Elyon Mitachta means that since the first thing that the Chumash discusses is if a regular person does an avera, so we compare it to the other people, just like the tzibor is davash's doinakar shigase chatas. So also by will apply that by a yachid. Says the Gemara. The Gemara says like this: a question. The Rebbe. How do Rabbi Shua Levi my avadle? What does Rebbe do with this pasuk of Torah achas yilachem la'oisi b'shgaga? So the Gemara says, Mapak le'likdetanya. That teaches you another concept. And that concept is like this. If a whole city does avodah zarah, right, I would think that there's a special kapara for that. Lefisha metzinu shechila kachosev ben rabim le'chidim. Rabim b'sayif u'mamayim ovid. When you have a whole city doing an avodah zarah, so you kill them out with the knife, and you destroy their money. Yechidim b'skila u'mamayim pollard. If an individual does an avodah zarah, then they get skila on purpose, of course, and their money, you don't do anything with their money. But let's say they do it by mistake. Yochel nachlet b'karbon seyan. So I would think that if a city does avodah zarah by mistake, they should have their own carbon. Because we already know in our animation over here that if an individual does avodah zarah, you bring a goat. If a Gans Klal Yisrael does an avodah zarah through the psak of Bezdin, as you can see on the screen, there's an oila and a chatas. What about if one city did avodah zarah? A lot of people did avodah zarah. I would think, according to Rebbe, that you bring a carbon. So the Gemara asks, Maskav Lor of Chivzia Mahagroino, what kind of carbon should they bring? Tamad chilik hakasav. Hachilik have a min nachlik. If the Torah didn't say they bring the regular goat, I would think that they should have their own carbon. My nicey, what should they bring? Nicey par, should they bring a cow? Sibur b'shab mitzvah suda maisi. Nicey par la'oil of sorry lechatis. Sibur b'avodah zarah hu d'maisi. Naisi so'ir, nasi b'shar mitzvahs hu demaisi. Naisi se'ira yachanami hani kabani. In other words, what the Gemara is going through the list, as we discussed in the picture, there's not what kind of carbon would you want a whole city to bring if they did avodah zarah by mistake? That you would feed a pasuk to tell me that they don't have to bring a carbon. I don't even know what carbon they would bring. So the Gemara says, Itzra. Salka daite chamina, tzibur maisi par la'oil sar lechachadas. And if a tzibur does that, they bring a par la'oil sar lechatas. Hani, if it was one city, naisi ipcha, par lechatas v'sari la'oila. That means that if there was the whole Klal Yisrael doing the Aveira, the cow is to the Oila, the goat is to the Chatas. But if I would think that if one city did an Aveira, did the Avodah Zarah, I would reverse it. The goat would be a Oila and the cow would be a Chatas. That's why you need that pasuk. Inami tzarach ve'elay tekano. I would say that a city that does all Avodah Zarah, they need a carbon, but we can't figure it out. Kamash Malam, no, they don't bring in a carbon. So even if an entire city does Avodah Zarah by mistake, they also bring a goat. Now, the Kuli Alma, everybody agrees, Mias, we're going to go another 4 or 5 minutes, and that's it. The Kuli Alma, everybody agrees, Ki kasivi hani kroi ba'avodah zarah hu deksivi. The psukim in Parsha Shalach is discussing Avodah Zarah. It doesn't say that. If you look at the pasuk, v'chisizgu, if everybody made a mistake and they didn't do every mitzvah, then they bring par la'oil chatas. It doesn't say they did avodah zarah. How do you know that parsha is talking about avodah zarah? My mashma. How do you see that the end of Parsha Shlach is talking about avodah zarah? Amar Ravi v'teim Rabbi Shua ben Levi Amar Kidi. This Amora Kidi told us the answer. Amakra, the pasuk says, V'chisishgu, if you make a mistake, v'loisasu eskol mitzvah se'ela, and you didn't do any of the mitzvahs. Ezehu mitzvah shishukula k'chol mitzvahs. What mitzvah is equivalent to all the other tayag mitzvahs? Haviyomer zu avodah zarah. That's avodah zarah. Because if you agree to avodah zarah, it's like denying the whole Torah. So avodah zarah is the most important mitzvahs. That's an indication that pasuk is talking about avodah zarah. The Rabbi Tani Amakra Shadiba Hashem Moshe Uksiv Ashetziva Hashem Elokechem Yad Moshe. Ezehu mitzvah she beduber shel Kadosh Baruch Hu v'tziva al yedei Moshe haveyomer zu avodah zarah. Because in the psukim in Parsha Shlach it says Tziva Hashem Dibar Hashem. If you don't do the mitzvahs that God commanded to Moshe, or God spoke to Moshe, which mitzvah did we hear God talk to Moshe and we were just listening in? God spoke, that God was talking to Moshe and we were listening in. That's avodah zarah, because the rest of the mitzvahs we never heard from Hashem, we only heard it through Moshe. So therefore, that parsha is talking about avodah zarah. Tana Rabbi Shmuel, like Rabbi Shmuel taught us, Anoichi v'lo mepi hagvuru shema anum. Anoichi and lo yilcha we heard from the Eibishter himself. The Bei Rabbi Shmuel Tana, now this is the third reason. So we have 2 reasons so far. How do you know it's talking about avodah zarah, that parsha? But there's a third proof that it's talking about avodah zarah. The Bei Rabbi Shmuel Tana, we learned that the Bei Rabbi Shmuel taught us. We go to Amud Beis. In the parsha of avodah zarah, at the end of a parsha Shlach, it says, from the day that Hashem commanded, this was like the first commandment that you got. Mitzvah shehi nemra b'tchila. So again, what mitzvah was the first commandment? Haviyomer zu avodah zarah. That's avodah zarah. That was the first commandment. So that parsha that talks about bringing a goat must be talking about you did the aveira of avodah zarah, because it says that you violated the first commandment that God ever gave. And anoichi and lo yilcha was the first commandment. Says the Gemara, that's not true. That's not the first commandment we got. The Jews got more mitzvahs prior to coming to Har Sinai. They got Paraduma, they got Kibbut Aveim. So that wasn't their first mitzvah. And so there's a pasuk that says we got mitzvahs in Mara. That the first answers were correct. Let us do just the Mishnah and then we'll stop. The Mishnah says, we said before that a par helam davar shel tzibor is brought if they told you can carry on Shabbos. The Bezdin said you can carry on Shabbos. What happens if Bezdin said you could go into the base of Migdash when you're tamei, or Bezdin said that you can be mitama kachim? So we know that if an individual makes a mistake with Tumas Migdash or Kedoshav, we saw Masechta Shavuos that the carbon is a carbon oil of yared. It's not a chatas kavua. It depends on your your financial stability. So your financial portfolio, if you could afford it. So therefore, it's a different type of carbon. Because of that, therefore, there's no parahelam davash and sibar. Ein chayavin al esev aloysish b'migdash. The ein meviin ashim tali ela esev v'shaloisha migdash. You don't bring an ashim tali if you make a mistake and you're not sure if you let's say you became tummy in the base of migdash and you're not sure if you left in the shortest route or you took the long route out. You don't bring an ashim tali if you make such a mistake if you're not sure. Aval, and this is how we'll end. Aval chayovin al esev loisha benida. If Bezdin makes a mistake, for example, I've been giving the example of Shabbos, but you can make an example of nida. They said that, let's say your wife tells you in the middle of the tashmish that his wife tells him she's a nida, and they said, okay, you can just end the tashmish, but that's usher. You have to wait till the misa se'ever. So therefore, the Bezdin would be required to bring a carbon parallel davas tzibur. If you're not sure if you violated nida, you bring an asham tali. Eza mitzvahs asay shabanida. What's a mitzvahs asay shabanida? Of course, nida you get karas. Proish min anida. You're supposed to wait to separate from a nida during the tashmish. If you find out she's a nida. And if you didn't, then there's a chorus and there's a chatas kavua, and therefore there would be a parhelam davash tzibur if the bezdin paskin. Mitzvahs loises say, what's a mitzvahs loises say of nida? Torah tells you al tovoi al hanida, don't have relations with a nida. And if they said you could have relations with a nida, if bezdin paskin and Klal Yisrael had relations with their wives and nida, then they would bring a parhelam davar shel tzibur. Okay, we'll stop over here. We'll catch up.